Hello and welcome back to the series Masters of the Chessboard. In this series we're going through the famous book by Richard Reti, Masters of the Chessboard, looking at each of the games in that book one at a time and Reti's analysis of those games. It is game number 54 and we're continuing to look at the games of Efim Bogoljubov. This time Bogoljubov has the black pieces, and his opponent, I don't know how to pronounce the name of, Walther von Holzhausen, I believe, has the white pieces. Now, before we start this game, Reti offers a bit of a background to this game. And he says that this game is very characteristic of Bogoljubov's optimistic and confident style. He says that how Bogoljubov carries out his plans in this game sort of illustrates his confidence. And even when he's perhaps in worse positions or losing positions, he's able to continue with his plan and almost try and dismiss his opponent's plans and his opponent's threats when those threats are not concrete. Now, Reti writes that this optimism isn't always the best way to play, but from a psychological point of view, it can be very effective. It may not be the best from an objective computer point of view, but psychologically it can be an effective way to play. Now, Reti says that when you're in a worse position, when you're in a worse position, a lot of players will try to attack at all costs without really considering the position itself. What is the position telling you to do? They won't really consider that. They will instead just try and attack at all costs, which often results in a faster defeat because the person with the advantage usually wants to try and keep an advantage. So will therefore try and avoid certain complications and will try and defend themselves as much as possible. So it makes attacks that aren't in line with the position less effective, and usually the person who is in a worse position will lose even quicker by trying to attack like that, because the person who has the advantage is trying to defend as much as possible. And the person who has the advantage is also sort of at risk of avoiding complications. They want to avoid complications, they want to convert the position easily and simplify down quite often. They want to try and avoid new attacks and sacrifices and things. And that can also be a weakness. The person with the advantage may want to avoid doing what the position tells them to do, even though the position, because the position may be telling them to attack, the position may be calling on their sacrifice, and yet, because they have the advantage, they sort of want to try and convert it easily, they sort of want to try and simplify down. And this desire to avoid these complications can also be a weakness. Therefore, Reti says that if you're in a worse position, one way you can try and play for an advantage still, or a draw, or even a win, is to essentially try and create a strong point. You should try and strengthen the strong points in your position to essentially make them definite objects in the way of your opponent, especially when your opponent is trying to win with less effort. So then your opponent just simply cannot break through with less effort because your strong points are incredibly strong. And he says that this game sort of follows these guidelines. In this game, Bogoljubov's position is slightly poor. He has an isolated pawn and a blocked pawn. His pawn on b5 becomes quite weak, and his king's side becomes open to attack. However, he has the open e-file, and he has this diagonal, a8 to h1. And of course, the square which crosses over, the square which is in line with both of these diagonal lines, is this e4 square. The e4 square is in this diagonal, it's on the e-file as well. So he makes this a strong point. And this is sort of similar to a game we saw with Lasker, game number 28, which is in this series, where Lasker realized he got into a worse position and he started playing for almost a strong point, and he forced his opponent to play in a very active way rather than a very slower positional way. Now the difference here is that Bogoljubov does this more through confidence and optimism, whereas Lasker chose to play that way because he knew his opponent would only play slower, more positional chess. So Lasker did it more psychologically, whereas Bogoljubov in his game does it more through sheer confidence and optimism. And we'll see what we mean during the actual game. So the game starts off e4, c5. So we have a Sicilian. Now we have knight f3 and e6. Now Reti comments that knight c6 he thinks is stronger since it can help stop a Maroczy bind. However, we sort of know that a Maroczy bind still isn't always possible. So, and I'll show why later on. So d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, and here we have knight c3. And the reason Reti preferred knight c6 as a second move, likely followed by e6, is because here white can play bishop to d3, attempting to get a Maroczy bind. Whereas obviously if black had a knight on c6, then he would just be hanging this d4 knight, because the knight can just take. Now, it's worth noting e5, obviously it loses a pawn to this check. It's also worth noting that we sort of know, even if black were to play this here, c4 still doesn't quite work. This is very similar to, you'll sometimes see this at the club level where people are trying to get a Maroczy bind against a Taimanov Sicilian. But here, black is just able to get far too much activity and initiative, and the Maroczy doesn't bind, so to speak. So we had d4 takes, knight f3. Instead of bishop to d3, we had knight to c3. And this knight f6 move is often played to try and force knight c3 to prevent c4. We then have d6 going into what we would now call a Scheveningen Sicilian. We have bishop e2, bishop e7, castles, king h1, a6, we have a4 to prevent b5, we have b6, f4, and bishop to b7. Now, we've sort of seen a very similar setup previously when we looked at the games of Maroczy versus Uwe, game number 36 in this series. Now, in that game, Maroczy had the white pieces, and in that game, black sort of allowed white to just constrict the position massively, and eventually black just got absolutely crushed. But here, Bogoljubov sees that this move f4 weakens this diagonal, because f3 is no longer possible. So this diagonal is now weakened. So Bogoljubov is very focused on trying to utilize this weakened diagonal. Now here we have bishop to f3, trying to counteract it. Now d5. And Reti says this is a very double-edged move, but it is consistent with Bogoljubov's plans. He's hoping to control this diagonal. So we have e takes d4, e takes d5. If white were to push, Bogoljubov just says that knight e4 is perfectly valid. So we have e takes d5, e takes d5, queen to d3, knight c6, knight takes, bishop to e3. And this is now what we were discussing in the introduction. So you see that this pawn on b6 is quite weak here. It's difficult to really defend this pawn. The a pawn can be defended by simply pushing it, but this pawn is going to be quite a weakness here. It's almost like an isolated pawn. And white's two bishops are very active along this diagonal. White's got a lot of pressure along towards the king's side. This rook is very active. White's almost got the activity here. It's black who's sort of having to defend. It's black with more of the weaknesses. However, Bogoljubov sees that he has this diagonal and he has the potential to control the e-file. So that's what he does. He tries to create a strong point on the e4 square where these two lines cross. So he plays rook to e8. We see rook a to d1. Bishop to b4. Sorry, no. Bishop to b4. And the reason he plays bishop b4 is if he's trying to control this e4 square, then trading off this knight would help control the square. We have bishop to d4, and now he finds knight to e4. Now he says that this looks like it was a bit of a blunder, but it's actually carefully considered, because many of white's combinations that appear to win can actually be countered. So, as an example, bishop takes e4. If we have pawn takes e4, queen to g3 is one potential option, essentially threatening mate. After f6, bishop to c5, discovering an attack against the rook. However, here is the beautiful move, just bishop takes c5, giving up the queen. Rook takes d8, rook takes d8. And basically what we have now is black has sacrificed the queen for the the queen for the rook and the bishop. Except here, black has a very powerful passed pawn. It's very easily going to become a protected pawn, and black has these two bishops just dominating the position, and the two rooks on almost the ideal squares. The rook on d8 is controlling the open file, the rook on e8 is guarding the passed pawn. So actually, it's a sacrifice of material almost, but it is black who has got the better game here. Now the alternative is still, let's say bishop takes e4, d takes e4, and then perhaps queen to c4, threatening to take the bishop. But then the variation given is bishop takes c3, queen takes c3, threatening the bishop and also still threatening g7. But then e3. So the threat is this fork. And after bishop takes e3, queen to c8, Reti comments that here black has sacked a pawn to essentially try and have a lot of strong pressure along the e-file. And even if black can't convert this because of the opposite colour bishops, it's likely going to be a draw. The other critical try, which is what happened in the game, is bishop takes g7. Now, if king takes g7, then the variation could go something like still bishop takes e4. Let's say d takes e4 and then queen to g3, discovering an attack on the queen. Let's say rook takes e4, well still knight takes e4 and you can't take back because of discovered attack. Or even then, you wouldn't even need a discovered attack, you can just take the queen. Because you're going to be up material. So we can't take, so instead we see queen to h4, getting the queen out the way of this x-ray attack. And now what's being threatened is knight to f2, which is forking the king and the queen, and obviously if the rook takes, the queen will take, or knight to g3, forking, because the pawn is pinned. So the h takes g3 is no longer possible. So because of that, white plays king g1. And Reti comments that white was very likely confident in victory here. He was up a pawn, his position looks a bit better, and so he makes a move that saves the exchange. But instead, white should have, instead of just trying to play more defensively, passively, he perhaps should have played a bit more aggressively with something like knight takes d5, so knight taking the pawn. Because after knight to g3 check, king g1, knight takes f1, we can then see something like rook takes f1 here, because after, say, bishop c5 check, bishop to d4, we see that white manages to get 2 pawns for the exchange. So white's basically given up a knight and I'm trying to think how to word it. So white's given up the exchange, but has gotten a knight, and knight's given up a rook for a knight and 2 pawns. It's a lot harder than I thought to word it. So yeah, so white has given up a rook for a knight and 2 pawns. And this is what Reti says should have happened. Here, white still has a lot of winning chances. But white was reluctant to go for that. He played king g1, just trying to defend everything. However, here we see f6, and now black can win a piece, and therefore he will win the game. Now, if we see bishop takes e4, perhaps intending after d takes e4, queen to c4 check, trying to pick up this bishop. Let's say king takes, we have queen takes c6. This doesn't quite work because white will have the in-between move, bishop to c5 check. So now after the king moves back, we take on e5. Obviously this check no longer picks up the bishop. We'll just say king takes g7 and black is just easily won. So f6 is played, essentially trapping this bishop. And now we see g3, pushing the queen away. We see queen to h3, knight takes e4, d takes e4, and bishop to c5. Queen to c5 check. And after king takes g7, queen takes c7, bishop to c5, king h1, and now e takes f3. So once all dust is settled, black is now a piece up. White responds by taking the pawn on f3, but now we see rook to e3. And the rook does hang, rook e3 does hang the rook on a8, but the queen can't take, because after rook to e2, there's no way to prevent mate. Mate here is just unstoppable. Or perhaps if you go there, you could then get mated on g2 instead, if you really don't want to get mated on h2. So here we see queen to b7 check. But after rook to e7, white resigned because the position is simply lost. Rook can come back to e2 and the game is lost. And so that's game number 53. Sorry, that's game number 54. We've got one more game of Bogoljubov after this, but this game sort of shows the ideas to play when you are in a slightly worse position. In that where you don't always try and focus on trying to attack belligerently. Instead, you try and create some strong points. You look at what the position is calling for. The position may be calling for a full-on kingside attack, but the position doesn't always call on that. Here, it doesn't call on the kingside attack. Here, the position calls on the use of this e4 square. So that's what Bogoljubov does. He tries to make this e4 square as strong as possible. Because then if white wants to try and break through on this e4 square, white's going to need to come up with some very good complications, very good sacrifices, or very good attacks and things, which he likely will be able to, but if he's in the mindset of just trying to simplify the position and win easily, he's probably not going to find it. And this is sort of what Reti is advising, to try and play along with the position more when you're losing, but still play almost as if you have some confidence in the position, which is what we see with Bogoljubov here. I hope you liked this video. It's game number 54, and I believe we have one more game by Bogoljubov before we start looking at the Reti opening. Reti has a chapter on his own systems of opening, which we will look at next. So thank you for watching, and if you do like the video, please do like, comment and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time.